Chapter 21, Test Firing. Only 3 Federation warships of the White Base class had been built: the Pegasus, destroyed in the conflagration on Texas, the Thoroughbred, and the Pegasus II. Because their solar panels, special hangars, and protruding bridge gave them a winged equine profile, the Zeon military code named them Trojan Horse. They were the only ships in either the Federation or Zeon forces specifically designed for mobile suits. The Gundam G3 and the 2 gun cannons, C-108 and C-109, stood on the Pegasus II foredecks, beam rifles in their hands like pilots on ancient sailing ships, but in this case, the real pilots, Amuro Ray, Kai Shiden, and Hayato Kobayashi, were inside the giant suits and not on the lookout for reefs. The Pegasus II had just come in effective range of missiles and mega-particle beam cannons from Abawa Ku. As Amuro watched, flashes appeared in the sky where the space fortress was located, and then instantly forked into multiple streaks. The pattern was repeated, each time from a different spot, and each time the streaks seemed synchronized. Missile barrages were coming at them from at least 15 different sites on the giant umbrella-shaped fortress and its periphery, creating a deadly crossfire. Because homing missiles were impractical in regions with high Minovsky saturation, it was common to launch large numbers of conventional missiles in a hit-or-miss approach. But Amuro was certain he was witnessing a record for the war. Thousands, not hundreds, were streaking toward them. While adjusting the sights of the beam rifle in the Gundam's left hand, he drew the hyper bazooka on its hip with the right hand. Then he kicked off the deck. On his rearview monitor, he saw the 2 gun cannons with their twin shoulder guns launch after him from the ship's starboard deck. Both Kai and Hayato had developed more and more confidence in their support role and their basic combat skills, and as soon as they assumed their positions on either side of him, they all plunged ahead in formation into the fire-streaked heavens. Kai and Hayato were not particularly worried about the incoming missiles hitting them. The missiles were unintelligent, randomly aimed, and flying in a straight line, so there was no need to try to intuit or predict complex course changes. They just had to avoid them in time, and that was not too difficult. They enjoyed a 280-degree field of vision, and ever since the last battle, their emerging new type skills had allowed them to work in an increasingly coordinated fashion. As they advanced, they occasionally picked off missiles on a course that appeared to threaten the Pegasus II, and every time the mothership safely made it through the ball of light from the explosions, they cheered inside their cockpits. "Hey, Mr. Hayato, it's working." "Not bad, not bad. At this rate, we'll land on the core of Abawa Ku and eliminate its commander in no time. What do you say, partner?" "Better happen soon. The longer this continues, the worse the odds are for us. My nerves and body aren't going to hold out forever. Let's go, Hayato, let's go." They were both excited and primed for action, but they made certain they stayed close to the Gundam. It was easier for Amuro to sight the line of approach of the missiles and evade them visually, so he was able to concentrate most of his mind on the panorama unfolding before them. He knew he needed to locate a dominating presence in the Abawa Ku region, similar to what he had sensed before in his encounter with Dorsal Zabi's unit in the Corregidor Shoal Zone. Then he had felt a strange, oppressive sensation. He had pursued it, and it had turned out to be psychic waves emanating from Dorsal himself. Now, if he could just detect the same thing again, he could move in, destroy the source, and in the process help fatally weaken Abawa Ku. Unfortunately, such manifestations of energy were apparently not always well defined, for although he could detect a diffused, seething mental energy emanating in swirls from the fortress itself, he could not isolate a single dominating force. Perhaps I'm still too far away. There had to be some other reason, he suspected, why the force was not as strong or defined as when he had encountered Dorsal Zabi. Then, in the vast area around Abawa Ku, he abruptly sensed a second attacking force, and his eyes widened. He knew they still hadn't cleared Abawaku's primary missile defense, and sure enough, there were suddenly more satellite missiles being lobbed at them. The crude projectiles were camouflaged black to avoid detection, and could attain a speed equivalent to that of modern missiles with head diameters ranging from 10 to 200 meters. At least a third of the Federation armada behind him was directly exposed, and in his rearview monitor he soon saw explosions flowering like fireworks in the vast area behind him. "We're coming to get you, bastards," he yelled at the enemy before him. It felt good to yell something. He thought about the destruction occurring behind him among his own forces, but restrained his impulse to shoot as many of the attacking missiles as possible. He had to save his ammunition for what he expected would soon be a new type showdown with Char Aznable. Then, in the midst of evading a barrage of missiles, he suddenly thought, oh. Behind one huge chunk of asteroid, he saw a brief glint of sunlight on a metal surface and realized he was staring at an entire formation of Gattle fighter bombers with camouflaged fuselages approaching under cover. Behind them, in a textbook pattern, was a formation of GECO attack ships, and following the GECOs was the main force of GAU bombers, reinforcing the defensive wall of Xeon mobile suits and the crossfire from the Abawaku fortress itself. General Revel knew the Federation armada would never take Abawaku unless it could find or create a weak link in the fortress's defenses. There were therefore three options: to try a feint maneuver and cause the enemy to over-concentrate its strength in one area and thus weaken its defenses in another, to stage a broad frontal assault and attempt to find a weak spot while doing so, or to focus all strength on one area and bore a hole right through the defenses. He knew the third option would yield the heaviest losses, but he had chosen it because he believed it had the highest likelihood of success. The vanguard of the armada would first assault the stem section of the umbrella-shaped fortress, where the defensive crossfire was at its weakest, and the Pegasus, second, as one of the point ships, would be given maximum flexibility as the attack proceeded. If an opportunity to make a breakthrough presented itself, it would be allowed to make autonomous decisions and act on them independently. It was a gamble, but he knew what he was doing. After having heard Amuro, Kai, Hayato, and the rest of the Pegasus 2 crew give their accounts of sensing Dozle Zabi in the midst of battle, he was convinced his plan would work. Even if the enemy were able to muster its own new type unit in defense of Abawaku, in the end he was certain the same new type unit would help lead the Federation fleet to the core of the fortress. Amuro had been fully briefed on the plan. Taking care not to let anyone pick him off along the way, he kept his senses focused on the area the enemy fortress occupied and tried to identify the nucleus of its defenses. He switched his main monitor to high-power telescopic mode for a few seconds, and in the distance he could easily see the fortress's silhouette. From his perspective, he was looking up at the umbrella portion of its superstructure. He could almost smell the stench of battle, the stench of impending death. Supreme Commander Giran Zabi knew his face was intimidating even on good days, but judging from Cecilia Eileen's reaction, he must have just scowled particularly hard. Even she, his personal secretary, a strong woman who knew his innermost secrets and his most private predilections, was terrified. He stopped reading the letter he had just received and glanced at her trembling form. Cecilia was one of the few women in the world he totally trusted. He had a legal wife, but he considered her beneath him intellectually and treated her more like a domestic, never appearing with her in public. Cecilia was only one of many women he had consorted with in the past, but she had proved the most outstanding. Of lower-class background, she had developed a strong, independent streak at an early age, studying to become a professional secretary while still a teenager. He had first been attracted to her shapely figure, but he had soon grown to appreciate her ability to understand people and her intuitive skepticism of their true motivations, both traits he valued highly. After she had worked in his office for over 2 years, he had made her his personal secretary. Cecilia was so accurate in her evaluations of people that he sometimes wondered if she might not be one of the new types his sister Caecilia often referred to. She had begun to function more like a counselor advisor than a secretary, and he in turn had begun to trust in her more and more. He loved her for her ability. Cecilia, for that matter, seemed to like his personality and style, and her affection for him, he liked to think, was also aided by the fact that he had managed to alleviate a long-standing sexual frustration of hers. She always tried hard to understand his emotional makeup and ways of thinking and rationalized whatever he did by borrowing from his system of logic. Several days earlier, she had learned of his plot and seemed to have approved. Jiren grumbled. Imagine these nitpicking numbskull clerks writing code numbers on letters and worrying about format at a time like this. Makes my blood boil. I just want the facts reported, especially for something like this. Cecilia smiled. It was the last thing she had expected Jiren to say, but she knew it was his attempt to make her feel relaxed. He, for his part, knew her smile had another meaning. He wasn't supposed to worry about her. He grinned. Did my expression really look that bad? Worse. He grumbled. Well, I never thought things would proceed exactly as planned. He again scanned the letter that had been delivered to him. It was from Vice Admiral Randolph Weigelman, the commanding officer on Abawa Ku. In the upper left-hand corner was the source of his displeasure. The code name for his plan was displayed in elegant capital letters, followed by the communication number. It therefore made a relatively short message that he wanted as few people as possible to notice, far too conspicuous. Dozel was defeated too easily, and Cassilia's forces don't seem to have helped him. Jiren's doubts began to gnaw in his mind, making him wonder if his secret plot was in danger of unraveling. Surely, he thought, the Federation forces must also have incurred heavy losses. After all, hadn't that been why they had suddenly moved away from the space fortress and retreated to the Corregidor Shoal Zone in the first place? I hope Vice Admiral Randolph Weigelman can hold up. Think I'm expecting too much? Jiren stared at Cecilia's ample bosom as he spoke, but his mind was focused on something else. It was a habit of his. As he watched, her chest suddenly heaved and then shook softly. Wondering what had happened, he suddenly looked up at her soft, full lips. I'd say so, she said. She was trembling, and Jiren knew it was not an act. Normally, Cecilia enjoyed watching Jiren plot and manipulate his subordinates to achieve a desired goal. It seemed like a thrilling game, and after the humiliations of her own life, she even derived a perverse sense of pleasure from it. But this time he was going too far, using the system plan to annihilate both his own sister Cassilia and Randolph Weigelman was too inhuman, even for her. And the loss, she feared, would be too great, even to Zeon. I'm not going to be angry with you, Cecilia, Jiren said. I understand your fears, but I know what I'm doing. Everything, including acting as a behind-the-scenes dictator here on Zeon, is merely a means to an end in a long historical process. You know, my father often accuses me of being a poor clone of Adolf Hitler, but it's not true. I know what I'm doing. Most people are by nature stupid and weak. They need to fall as far as they can before they can be saved. If Zeon Zum Daikun's prophecy of a new human enlightenment is more than a dream, then I'm going to be the one to make it possible. I swing the axe. Those with true new type potential will avoid it. Those without it won't. It's that simple. Jiren finished talking, stood up, and walked around his desk to Cecilia. I think you're going a little too far this time, sir. She had finally dared to say it. Jiren's use of the system represented far too big an axe for any single individual to swing. Jiren was stung by her remark. You're stepping out of line, Cecilia, he said. She suddenly looked humiliated. Sorry, sir, she replied with a pained expression. Please, forgive me. Then he leaned over her and with his lips began gently caressing the nape of her neck. Cecilia felt a sudden chill, a chill of fear. She knew Jiren was irritated. She always prided herself on the fact that she never put undue pressure on him and that she served him well. She knew he kept only capable people around him, and she was always prepared for the moment when he would no longer need her. She knew what had happened in the past to women who knew too much and of whom he had then tired. They wound up ruined or dead. To avoid that fate, she had tried extra hard to develop her skills and make herself indispensable, both as a woman and as his executive secretary. She was, in a sense, constantly engaged in a subtle competition with him, a competition that, since her life was at stake, always had an element of danger in it. And in a perverse psychosexual way, she always enjoyed that. She felt his lips trace the nape of her neck and imagined what life would be like without him. She would lose her biggest competitor, her most worthy competitor. But she knew right now he was just trying to butter her up. She pulled away. Did I do something wrong?" he asked. Cecilia could hardly believe what she had heard. For a second, the Supreme Commander of the Principality of Zeon had almost sounded contrite. She quickly recovered and smiled at him. "You're being sweeter than usual. I just wish you'd act naturally." A frown suddenly creased Guerin's brow. "What are you getting at?" he said, suddenly upset. "Well, maybe you shouldn't be in such haste with the project," she said. Her heart was pounding, and she practically bit her lip when she spoke. "Are you trying to provoke me, Cecilia? Don't you understand? If I can just void the Treaty of the Antarctic, a lot of problems will be solved. If the system just works as it's supposed to, then we can nuke the Federation's Jaburo headquarters. After that, it'll be all over. The war'll end in a week." Cecilia understood the logic of what Guerin was trying to do. Within a month after the Principality of Zeon had begun its war with the Federation, both the Zeon and the Federation had lost nearly half their entire populations. It had been a terrifying loss of not only lives but human resources, for losing such a huge number of people in such a short time nearly destroyed most vital social organizations. Civilization had tottered on the brink of total collapse, but then, in a testimony to mankind's resilience, most organizations had been recreated on a new, scaled-down size. The Earth Federation had initially lost far more people than the Principality of Zeon had, but the Federation had managed to recover faster. It possessed far more people and resources to begin with, and it also possessed a far more flexible political system. But because the human losses had been so horrendous, after the Battle of Loom both the Zeon and the Federation had agreed to sign the Treaty of the Antarctic, a far-reaching agreement that stipulated the way prisoners were to be treated, and, in a move that had broad implications for the rest of the conflict, prohibited all use of poison gas and nuclear weapons as well as attempts to totally destroy each other's colonies. The treaty even confirmed possible procedures for terminating the war, but that was as far as the talks had gotten. After all the killing, the two adversaries were simply incapable of resolving their differences over a negotiating table. Their views of each other were poisoned by distrust, and in a world where ideals and realities coexisted, the realities won out. The whole negotiating process was, as Jirenzabi often claimed, a classic example of human stupidity. The paradox of history, he liked to say, was that in nations of laws, even bad laws had to be obeyed, but the laws themselves were made to be broken. Nonetheless, men still legislated, generated endless fancy legal documents, and promulgated worthless treaties. Well, I suppose you're trying to suggest that even after losing half our population, we still have more than they did then, right? Right. There are more people alive now than there ever were at the end of the 20th century, when modern science and technology made their most dramatic progress. So any talk about too many people having been killed thus far in the war is utter nonsense. The bureaucrats on Earth running the Federation's stupid system aren't helping prepare us for a new type age. They're just getting in the way. They're useless, and so's the Treaty of the Antarctic. If all it takes to destroy the Federation's Jaburo complex is a couple of nuclear warheads, I say they ought to be used. Someone has to do it. Cecilia noted Guerin's expression. He appeared utterly sincere. Then he whispered, "Get me Admiral Chapman-Jiram." "Because I want to stay alive," Chalia replied. The Brabro fuselage separates into left and right modules, which allows the cockpit to function as an escape capsule. It'll be easier for me to get out of in a jam. You're joking, I assume. Think so? Chalia asked as Leroy handed him a razor. I want to contact the Gundam as early as possible. The Brabro uses a pseudo-Psycamu interface, but it actually does emit a small amount of brainwaves, and I think it'll help. Well, I'm not in a position to question your judgment in this matter, Lieutenant, so I'll just have to take your word for it. Char knew full well that Chalia had been sent to his unit by Jirenzabi to spy on him, and that Chalia was still superficially carrying out his duties for the Supreme Commander. But he also knew Chalia was now on his side. Both men believed in the new type vision and would do whatever they could to make it come true. Both men had also come to realize the need to stop the insane war going on around them. But to do that, they would first have to escape from Abawa Ku, and there was not a minute to lose. The Federation Gundam mobile suit was becoming too powerful for them, and after leaving Abawa Ku, they were determined to avoid engaging it in direct combat. They had agreed earlier that if, as they suspected, they were unable to destroy it quickly, they should try to enlist its pilot in their cause. In their next encounter, they would make the decision. Chalia Bull, at great personal risk, had volunteered to try to contact the Gundam. I just wish I could say this plan worked with more certainty, Chalia said, sighing. The most difficult thing, Char added, is to get close enough to communicate with Amuro Ray, the pilot. Think he'll let us? Leroy Gilliam interjected. I'll try to help make it possible, he said. Can I also assume it's okay to destroy him if I have to? Leroy sounded too eager. He had what Char and Chalia recognized as youthful overconfidence. If you can get a beat on him, good, Char said, but make sure you aim for his backpack. Then looking up at the newly delivered Zakas cramped together in the narrow hatchway of the hangar, he added, at least we'll have some company out there. Yes, sir, Leroy answered with a snappy salute. Then he kicked off the deck and floated up to the Rickdom hatch, climbed in, and began strapping himself in the cockpit. Char turned to Chalia Bull. Since the two of them were finally alone, he told him what he had learned from Caecilia of Guerin's plot. Me here, but I need something to believe in, and right now I'm ready to follow you. The most important thing for us now is to time our escape right, so we aren't annihilated by Guerin, and we need to contact the Gundam before it's too late, and either destroy it or enlist it as an ally. There you go. We've got to watch out for the Gundam. The thing's turned into an over-efficient killing machine. We've both got to stay alive. Amuro Ray's the pilot, right? I think you once called him single-minded or straightforward, right? Frankly, sir, I'm a little envious of him. Sometimes it's not a good idea to be too single-minded, Lieutenant. No, sir, I agree, Chalia said. We're too complicated ourselves, Commander Char. Or should I say Kesval Daikun. The men shook hands and climbed into the cockpits of their respective machines. 30 minutes later, the 300th Autonomous, Char's new type unit composed of 1 Brabro, 4 Rickdoms, and 5 Zakas, launched from the stem of Abawa Ku and soared toward the combat zone. A new type unit, Char thought as his Rickdom led the way. It sounds nice, but who knows what it really means. There's no precedent for this. From that point on, he had no time for philosophizing. The entire area in front of him was laced with stabbing beams of light, and he had to concentrate with his whole being simply to stay alive. He even forgot about Margaret Ring Blair. He was not piloting a Zaku anymore, but he was still the Red Comet. Along with the senior members of Caecilia Zabi's staff, Margaret Ring Blair boarded the Swammel. She knew a military showdown was approaching, for the crew shoved them into the ship's armory like cattle, shouting something about defending Abawa Ku to the death. It did not make sense to her. If they were going out to defend the space fortress, she did not understand why so many of the officials associated with Caecilia were also being taken. As she watched, the last senior secretary entered, accompanied by Crowley Heyman. One of the ship's younger officers addressed them. We may see action any minute now, so until ordered otherwise, you must all remain in this room. There are normal suits in the locker over in the corner. I advise checking them right now. With that, he left, closing the hatch behind him. Margaret made her way across the room past her colleagues, to Crowley. Hi, she said. Tell me if it's my imagination, but things seem to have changed awfully fast around here ever since you walked into Her Excellency's office. What's going on? Crowley pulled back with a shocked look. How should I know, she said, and why don't you mind your own business anyway? Despite the rude rebuff, Margaret stared at Crowley's profile and could not help admiring the beautifully shaped bridge of her nose. On the bridge of the Swammel, Caecilia Zabi issued the order to leave port. She had been assigned the task of defending the S-field around the stem section of the Abawa Ku fortress. and had boarded the Swammel with every appearance of personally supervising the defense from the front. Technically, since she had informed neither Giran nor the fortress commander, Vice Admiral Randolph Weigelman, she was still supposed to be in the S-Sector Command Center, but none of the men who served her objected. They were relieved to see her with them. They much preferred to have her risk her life with them than to have her yelling out orders from the safety of the rear. None, needless to say, were aware that she had really boarded the ship in a desperate attempt to avoid being vaporized in Giran Zabi's diabolical plot. Caecilia turned to the communications officer on the Swammel Bridge and sternly ordered, "The Vice Admiral's in the N-Sector Command Center, but I want you to make absolutely sure all communications between me and him are routed through the S-Sector Command Center." Then she tried to send a message to Randolph inquiring about the position of Mahar. After several abortive attempts, she finally received a reply. 10 minutes from now, we'll receive supporting fire from Mahar, Excellency," Randolph said, unaware of what was really being planned, with the first blast at 30% of potential output. The second will occur 20 minutes after the first. "The first one comes 10 minutes from now?" Caecilia asked. "We expect the Federation attackers will be routed after the first blast. The Mahar cylinder will be on the Geldorf axis." From his comments, Caecilia deduced that the first blast was for calibration purposes only, and that meant that the second was intended for her. If the second blast 30 minutes from now doesn't attain the target output and doesn't do the job, Excellency, the Supreme Commander has promised to send us reinforcements. An entire fleet of ships is apparently launching right now. "Ha," Caecilia retorted. "I hope they have a lot of firepower. Surely you don't really think he's going to send us help that arrives 2 or 3 hours late and then expect us to thank him, do you?" She asked the young Vice Admiral to continue sending her information on Mahar, and then unilaterally signed off. The fool, she thought. He doesn't even know what Giran has in store for him. Randolph Weigelman was a somewhat naive officer, and she knew there was no way in the world he could be acting. She ordered her communications officer to keep the laser channel with the S-Sector Command Center open. Then, with several supporting ships following in its wake, the Swammel pulled away from the Abawaku port. Amuro had finally located what he was looking for. In the area in front of him, from slightly to his right, he felt a weak force flowing out toward him. Something was approaching at high speed. "I hope I'm not emitting the same sort of energy," he thought. If he were, he wished he could somehow turn it off, for he knew anyone else in the area with new-type potential, someone, for example, like Shar Aznable, would easily be able to detect him. He knew from books that some legendary samurai warriors had been capable of detecting another's presence, and conversely, of stilling their own minds in order to mask their own presence. But he lived in the real world, where things were more complicated, where scientists had never even defined human consciousness. It was ridiculous to assume that psychic vibrations, or even the complex presence of new types, could be intentionally controlled or suppressed. He did not want to believe, for example, that Dozal Zabi had a special ability to generate the eerie, specter-like aura he had detected oozing from his machine. If that was what a new type represented, he did not want to have anything to do with it. New types who emitted frenzied, crazed auras were freaks. To be a true new type, he realized, meant far more than merely possessing a simple ability, a talent that others could exploit. It meant being an integral part of humanity. New types were above all human, and humans were living beings. They were all inseparable. He began to wonder. When an individual's consciousness was raised and expanded, could it exist independently from the physical form? Would the physical body then be necessary? If the ability to generate an independent, free-floating consciousness was a survival advantage in the harsh environment of space, if only the spirit, consciousness, or thought energy could transcend time and space, who would need a physical form? Was the physical body merely a means of generating an independent consciousness? It might take enormous effort and training, but he wanted to believe he could somehow control the development of his own consciousness. He had long ago realized that having a special gift did not guarantee a superior or moral character, although people tended to excuse nearly every action of someone they deemed gifted. In his own case, his much-discussed new type potential was escalating, becoming increasingly independent. assertive, and even dangerous. His insights and his sense of prescience could help him win battles and help him survive. But it was taking him in a totally different direction from the profound shared empathy and spiritual communion that both Lala-san and Cusco Al had taught him were possible. The more he thought about it, the more confusing it all seemed. Salem S appeared to have some traits similar to his, but was he really interacting with her the way he should? Wasn't he just playing the typical male? Did the two of them really wish to have a relationship that went beyond the physical? Were they not simply two healthy young people of the opposite sex, caught up in the time compression that occurs in war, seeking temporary distraction and solace? Ultimately, Amuro knew that he was only a military pilot, and that there was a limit to what he could do. It made him feel impotent and trapped. Philosophize as he might, he had to fight to survive. His only reward was survival. Someone else he knew would reap the rewards of his victories. Someone like the Earth Federation leaders, secure in the safety of their underground headquarters in Jaburo. Amuro's thoughts transpired in seconds, but their intensity fueled a new anger in his body that threatened to explode. He cursed, and then suddenly an enemy Zaku came at him from his upper right. "Whoa!" he yelled. He fired, and a single blast from his beam rifle destroyed the enemy machine. At the same instant, he spotted over a dozen Jiko attack ships plunging forth in tight formation from behind the shelter of another satellite missile. He fired 2 blasts from his hyper bazooka and hit the 2 lead ships on either side. Miraculously, the ensuing explosions took out several other ships in the formation. The other Jikos slipped away to the rear, and he knew he wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. They were moving into a zone where battles were raging, but their likelihood of survival there was far greater than it would be against the Gundam. "See you later," he yelled after them. The satellite missiles from Abao Aku were now providing both interference and cover for all combatants in the area. Several Zakus approached from behind one, but Amuro drove them toward Kai and Hayato. At the same time, he was careful to keep his attention focused on the presence approaching from his right. But then a Musai-class ship on his left suddenly turned toward him and fired a volley of beam blasts at him with astonishing accuracy. He was moving through space at maximum combat speed, and because of the magnetic coating on the Gundam's mechanical system, he had over twice the agility of a Zaku. Nonetheless, the beams kept getting closer and closer. It was extremely difficult to knock out a ship with a single shot unless it turned its prow directly toward him, so he aimed his rifle at its main engine. With all the blasts from its cannons, the ship was enveloped in light and hard to see clearly. But he knew what he had to do and fired. With a whomp, the Musai exploded like a giant incendiary flare. The light spread throughout the combat zone, illuminating the nearby enemy suits and smaller ships. And in the few seconds before the glow faded, Kai and Hayato were able to pinpoint most of the suits and destroy them. In a superbly coordinated performance, the Gundam and the 2 gun cannons had virtually eliminated any effective resistance in their immediate area. On Kaisilia Zabi's warship, the Swammel, the communications officer received a transmission from the Zeon. "System now in operation. 30 seconds till firing. Line of elevation, ZZ-32 Chux X-22, Geldorf axis." The operator on the Swammel bridge yelled, "Abao Aku, field knee, 323,664, distance 50 kilometers. Think we can clear the area in time?" Kaisilia asked. From the perspective of the Swammel's bridge, Abao Aku was 50 kilometers starboard to the stern. The captain of the Swammel looked up anxiously at Kaisilia. "All ships in the area have received the transmission," he said. "But there's such a high concentration of Minovsky particles in the area that radio is largely unintelligible. I don't know how many of the laser communications have gotten through." Kaisilia was nervous, but convinced that Garen would not use the first blast on her. When the war was over, if he was impeached and investigated because of the system project, he would need some sort of justification for what he was doing. He would need to establish that he had intended to use the laser cannon to destroy the Federation fleets and support Abao Aku. The first blast would serve as his alibi. City. Jiren Zabi sat down in the spacious leather reclining chair reserved for the commanding officer. It was his job to push the button to activate what had now been dubbed the solar ray laser cannon. And he took his job seriously. It was, in a sense, the final weapon. Output 28%, approaching 35%. Start countdown. 10, 9, 8. A giant display in the center of the room showed a full view of the Mahar colony. Over a dozen monitors to the right showed the operations room of the Battleship Guild, from which the entire Mahar cylinder was controlled. On one of the screens, the strained face of Admiral Chapman Jerome appeared, looking in Guerin's direction. Guerin acknowledged him with a nod, while noting what a cowardly expression he wore. He had clearly overestimated the man's mettle, and would have to reconsider whatever assignments he entrusted to him in the future. "Zero," the operator yelled, a little late. Guerin pushed the special ignition button in front of him. Whoosh! Guerin reflexively shielded his eyes with his hands and yelled, "This is what we get at 35%? Is the colony cylinder going to hold up?" Despite an automatic exposure control filter, the main display had turned sheer white, and as he stared at it, his first concern was that the cannon might not last long enough to be used in the next step of his plan. Then, as the screen gradually returned to a more normal exposure, the men in the operations room saw the unimaginable. One end of an entire sealed cylinder colony had opened and spit a laser beam 6 kilometers in diameter into space, creating residual flashes and sparks that illuminated the entire area. The beam was at less than half the output for which the system was designed, but never before in history, Guerin suspected, had man generated one so powerful. It took only a fraction of a second for the solar ray beam to reach the Earth Federation armada, but Amuro Ray detected it before it struck. The force that had been bearing directly down on him earlier was suddenly overwhelmed by an immense pressure from his right. He turned his head, and in the same instant saw a beam of light split the heavens. Immediately, he knew something horrible had happened. In space, even in heavily contaminated areas, laser beams were usually invisible unless they reflected off debris and dust. But he had seen the beam. Immediately, enormous balls of light began to mushroom behind him as Federation ships in the beam's path exploded. First he counted 12 flashes, then more and more, 18, 20, 23. Could 23 ships really have been destroyed? He was unable to confirm their size, but judging by the magnitude of the explosions, he knew most were at least cruiser class. Then, as the light slowly dissipated, he sensed another, different force pushing at him from behind. It had the same oppressive quality he had experienced once before in his encounter with Dozel Zabi, but it was a compound, overlapping, merging cluster of forces. It took only a fraction of a second for the solar ray beam to reach the Earth Federation armada, but Amuro Ray detected it before it struck. The force that had been bearing directly down on him earlier was suddenly overwhelmed by an immense pressure from his right. He turned his head, and in the same instant saw a beam of light split the heavens. Immediately, he knew something horrible had happened. In space, even in heavily contaminated areas, laser beams were usually invisible unless they reflected off debris and dust. But he had seen the beam. Immediately, enormous balls of light began to mushroom behind him as Federation ships in the beam's path exploded. First he counted 12 flashes, then more and more, 18, 20, 23. Could 23 ships really have been destroyed? He was unable to confirm their size, but judging by the magnitude of the explosions, he knew most were at least cruiser class. Then, as the light slowly dissipated, he sensed another, different force pushing at him from behind. It had the same oppressive quality he had experienced once before in his encounter with Dozel Zabi, but it was a compound, overlapping, merging cluster of forces. It was like an enormous howl from thousands of souls on the cusp of death that welled outward, disturbing the basic elements of the universe. He gasped in awe. He felt he was directly witnessing a physical manifestation of pure hate so intense that it could shake the heavens. He began to tremble, and then, to his astonishment, he felt or heard an enormous reverberation. It was a force that was not physically supposed to exist. It came out of nothing, and it resonated through a vacuum. It was like a roar of a giant tremor. Even the Gundam fuselage seemed to shake. Where is it? Where is it? He opened his mouth to scream, and the moment he did so, lost sight of the presence he had locked onto earlier. But he was still unable to lose the sensation that had built up in both his ears and his cerebrum. It permeated every pore in his body and threatened to tear him apart. In a futile attempt to ignore it, all he could do was scream over and over again. Where is it? Where is it? Over his headphones he heard Hayato calling, Amuro! Amuro! What happened? But he could not answer. Kai followed immediately, barely audible with all the static in the area, yelling, Hayato, can you read me? This is Kai. Where's Amuro? I can't see him. Both men were disturbed and were experiencing the same reaction he was, but their voices helped him get a grip on himself. He had to notify them of his position. The three of them needed to stay together, stay in tune with each other, if only to help detect approaching threats. He knew turning on his 360-degree friend or foe, laser ID sensors in a combat zone could cost him his life. Hoping the enemy was not watching, he hit the switch for a second. It worked. Both Kai and Hayato were now seasoned combat veterans, and the instant they detected his FOF signal, they moved to assume their normal formation on either side of him. With a shorter distance separating them, radio communication suddenly became dramatically clearer. The flashes came from the area where the main Federation force is supposed to be. Hayato yelled, What the hell happened? I think it was some sort of laser attack, Amuro said. I'm not sure, but it seemed like it came from the direction of the Zeon. I could almost see it. He was only guessing. He had no idea what had really happened. But the sensation that had made his flesh crawl a moment earlier was slowly starting to dissipate. Amuro, Kai yelled. It felt like a cold blast right through my body. What was it? How the hell should I know? Amuro retorted. Concentrate on what the enemy's doing now, not on what happened. They're starting to swarm around here. He was not kidding. Suddenly, more and more rocket flares were visible, indicating more ships and suits launching into the darkness out of Abaoku. And judging by their coordinated movements, none of the Zeon pilots seemed affected by the incredible force Amuro and his comrades had just experienced. Kai was frantic. Damn it, what the hell's going on? Maybe you felt it 'cause you're a new type, Kai, Amuro said, sardonically. But don't let it go to your head. Amuro, I'm serious. Kai was shocked by his comrade's tone, but he intuitively knew what he meant. And he also suspected that Amuro, in his ability to sense what was really happening, was evolving far beyond either himself or Hayato. I wish I'd seen the look on your face when you said that, he added, trying to put up a good front. I'm not joking, Kai, Amuro added. Once you let your abilities go to your head, it's like filtering reality, and the filter gets in the way. For most people, it's better to not be aware of the kind of force we just felt. His tone was half scolding now, but then he suddenly interrupted his speech and turned the Gundam's head to the side. A formation of Gattle fighter bombers was bearing down on them. Here they come, he yelled as he aligned the sights on his beam rifle. Sir, Vice Admiral Carroll's entire fleet has been wiped out, a staff officer announced to an ashen-faced General Revel, seated at his desk in the rear of the Drogs Joint Operations Center. We suspect a sneak attack with some sort of giant laser weapon, sir. Over 40 craft suddenly vanished. We've contacted only 2 surviving Coral-class ships, and they're linking up with us now. We're still conducting an investigation, but there appears to be a strong possibility that the attack originated from the Principality of Zeon itself. Check what's happening with the Mahar colony immediately, Revel ordered. His white-gloved hands kept trembling even though he had clasped them together. He moved them out of sight under his desk and tried desperately to maintain an aura of control. My God, he thought, staring at the top of his desk. What if we lose the war? I suppose Guerin would spare the average citizen, and if he got rid of the Jaburo bureaucrats, it'd be no big loss, I suppose. But what if all mankind had to grovel before the maniac for eternity? Then the same officer spoke again, and Revel heard the words. "But there's some good news, sir. I'm pleased to report that some of our units centered around the 127th Autonomous have reached the first combat line around a Bao-Wa-Ku." Revel finally raised his face up and tried to sweep his earlier defeatist notions out of his mind. As long as those kids are still fighting, he thought, I've got to be here for them. He stood up and, on a holographic operations map, indicated the course they should take with a light pen. "Our surviving fleets," he announced, after regaining his composure, "will try to breach a Bao-Wa-Ku defenses after the 127th has created an opening for us. We can assume the Zeon has finally fired the secret weapon we've been hearing rumors of, what they code-named the system. It must require enormous power, so I can't imagine they'll fire it again right away, especially if we use a Bao-Wa-Ku as a shield. I want an all-out attack on the fortress immediately." Revel knew that if, as he suspected, Zeon had actually activated a colony-scale laser cannon, it would be futile to try to flee. They would probably be destroyed by another blast even before any Zeon pursuers caught up with them. On the other hand, although the cannon was powerful, it was indiscriminate. During the last blast, several Zeon ships in the wrong area at the wrong time had certainly been vaporized. It would therefore be impractical for the Zeon military to target an area where too many of its own craft were currently engaged with the enemy. The risk of destroying its own ships would be too great. Why, Revel wondered, hadn't Zeon fired its cannon before the Federation forces reached the Bao-Wa-Ku area? It was a mystery to him, and the only explanation he could think of was that the device had malfunctioned. That's what always happens with new technology, he thought. Preparations probably took longer than planned. The odds in the battle had clearly shifted in Zeon's favor. And now, because of the laser cannon, there could be no retreat. There was only one thing to do, he concluded, and that was to stake everything on a final assault on a Bao-Wa-Ku and hope to occupy it. The prospects for success were bleak, but there was one ray of hope, and that was the 127th. It had advanced faster and farther than he had thought possible. It's time, he thought. It's time to stake everything on the Pegasus II and its young crew. Lieutenant Chalia Bull had known the laser cannon was about to fire. But when Vice Admiral Carell's fleet was vaporized, he had nonetheless experienced a sensation as terrifying as that felt by a Muro ray. His Brabro had far more powerful engines than either a Rikdom or a Zaku, so when he detected the presence of the Gundam and two other enemy suits in the combat zone, he quickly moved out in front of Char Aznable. Char made no attempt to stop him. He knew Chalia was not hurrying simply because he wanted to get to engage the enemy. He knew Chalia was operating on another level and following something that he, Char, could not detect. He also knew instinctively that the time had come for him to support Chalia in combat, rather than the other way around. It was time to follow the Brabro. He felt connected to Chalia by a thread of consciousness that enabled them to work together as a team. He felt joined by a conviction, a belief in a common goal. They were headed toward a dark force that even he could somehow sense. Just when Chalia sensed a faint presence ahead of him, and wondered if it might be the young Gundam pilot, the Mahar laser cannon fired. From Sharia's perspective, hell suddenly broke loose. A curdling mass of blackness roared toward him, and he felt his Brabro shudder. As with the Federation pilots in the area, there might have been no physical movement of his machine, but the sensation was real. Instinctively, he initiated an evasive maneuver, but the force was greater than anything he had ever experienced before. It swept through his entire being, from his brain to his tailbone, rushing like a wall of black static and threatening to rip his vital organs out of his body. He could scarcely believe he was still alive, for the sensation of living, of awareness of the external world, rode precariously atop a thin layer of skin, which in turn rode atop his flesh and bones, and they were shaking uncontrollably. He burst into sweat, and pools formed around his feet inside his normal suit. His psyche rocked with waves of rage and grief. I hope I come out of this intact, he thought vaguely, as he stared transfixed at the exploding Federation fleet in the darkness. If I don't start moving, the Gundam will destroy me. I've got to move. But if I die now, the terror will vanish, and what's wrong with that? That might be better. Then there emerged a more sobering thought that death might not be an escape. If there was an afterlife and his soul survived, it would be permanently scarred. His thoughts were an internal scream of despair and an attempt to dispel his growing fear. The next instant he returned to his senses and became acutely aware of the sweat-caked underwear clinging to his skin. He did a quick 360-degree scan of the area his bra was drifting in and decided he was in no immediate danger of being sniped at by the Gundam, but he knew he had to hurry before another blast came from the laser cannon. He had some business to take care of, and its importance transcended everything else. It was not yet time to die. He checked the area once more and then heard, amid the static generated by Minovsky interference, a near scream from his commander. "Chaliabul, hurry!" Char Aznable yelled from his Rick Dom. Chalia knew then that Char too had experienced it. All crew concentrate on assigned tasks. No wavering now. The enemy's in front of us, not behind. Bright, standing erect on the bridge of the Pegasus II, scolded Mirai and Sayla on either side of him, and when he did so, his mic, still switched to shipwide, picked up and broadcast his words throughout the craft. Immediately following the laser cannon attack, several of the crew had experienced the same force as Amuro, Chalia, and others. Some had been literally thrown out of their seats. Sayla Mass had clung to her communications panel for dear life, trembling in sheer terror. Mirai Yashima had managed to hold the ship's helm steady but had nearly vomited on it. Others, such as ship's operators Mark Cran and Oscar Dublin and Bright himself, had felt the force but had not been affected so directly. Mirai, with spittle flying, yelled back at her skipper. That felt like a wind from hell, but it's not the sort of presence a true new type would generate. Behind her normal suit visor, she looked deathly pale, with her eyes starting to roll upward. She looked half-crazed. "Some didn't feel a thing," Bright shouted, swallowing hard. "They're the ones in real danger now. We don't have a moment to lose. Just keep your eyes on the area we're heading into." "Oh my God," Mirai groaned. Bright had been right. A formation of 6 Gattle fighter bombers had already slipped through their starboard defenses. She spun the helm, and the ship heaved to port. She knew intuitively that fear was her worst enemy, that it could kill her, and she desperately tried to separate her paranoia from reality. She wished she could wipe off the spittle spattered on her face, but to do so she would have had to remove her helmet. Then she heard a whomp. The officer of the deck screamed on a central monitor. "We've taken a hit in Sector 362. Wait, it looks like a Gattle fighter bomber crashed into us." Following his words, a computer graphics simulation of the damage appeared on screen. "On the double," Bright yelled, sounding slightly hysterical. "I want wall film applied immediately. Sayla, double-check the lines to all anti-air observation posts." He knew he had to calm down. His psyche had been rattled by the force earlier, perhaps not as much as Sayla and Mirai, but it had nonetheless slammed into his mind and rocked him. He knew the most important thing now was to help the core crew regain their senses, and that the best way to do that was to bark orders at them. "Yes, sir." Sayla shakily answered in response to his order. Her pupils were still dilated and trembling. She had suddenly become incontinent. "Char's on his way." Bright shouted, "Think of something we can do." His words seemed to have an effect. "Yes, sir," she replied, checking anti-air observation posts. She turned to her communications console, suddenly looking very frail. "Mark," Bright yelled out to the ship's operator. "Find out what happened behind us immediately." "Yes, sir," Mark replied. "Working on that right now. I know it sounds incredible, but it looks like Vice Admiral Corell's fleet was hit by some sort of laser blast." "Sayla," Bright barked, "open a radio channel for me." "Yes, sir, channel open." She switched an all-range radio channel over to the receiver on the captain's seat, and out of the corner of her eye saw Bright fiddle with some controls on the front of his normal suit. Then she turned to Mirai and asked, "Can you feel it? Is it Char?" Looking doll-like in her normal suit, Mirai replied, "No, not yet." Sayla leaned over and stared out the bridge window at the panorama of open space. In the center, beam blasts from the Pegasus II's main cannons were pulsing toward Abawaku, and on either side, beams and regular fire from other ships and the fortress crisscrossed through the blackness, punctuated by explosions. And in the midst of this visual chaos, she sensed an enormous upheaval of the human psyche. Instinctively she knew, someone else, not just the men and women of the Carl fleet, will die. Someone else. But much to her chagrin, she had no idea who it would be.